Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Considerations for Marketing Meat Twilight Q&A session. We decided to offer this session after receiving a lot of questions from producers in Tennessee who are interested in marketing meat directly to consumers. In this time of COVID-19, perhaps they had been getting questions from consumers who were looking for meat, or perhaps they were looking at different market opportunities because of the state of the commodity livestock markets. So we are going to be talking about several topics here related to marketing of meat considerations. We are all extension specialists. So our speakers tonight are Rob Holland, Hal Pepper, and Megan Lefew, that's me, from the Center for Profitable Agriculture, and we are a department within UT Extension. The great thing about our job is that we are educators and not regulators. So the information that we present tonight is for educational purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice, or if we get into anything medical, it does not constitute medical advice either. We are going to cover a lot of ground tonight, including live animal sales for custom-exempt processing, retail meat sales, special label claims, non-retail meat sales, and sales tax regulations. And then we'll try to answer questions about these topics and perhaps others along the way. So typically this takes us over 3 hours to cover all of the information that we hope to condense and give you some of the basics for tonight, and then lead you to some additional resources. But we felt it was important to try to get some answers out there to questions that a lot of people are asking. So to kick us off tonight, Rob Holland is the director of our Center for Profitable Agriculture, and he's going to be discussing live animal sales for custom-exempt harvest and processing. Rob?
Good evening, folks, and thank you, Megan, for the introduction and putting this together. As folks registered for this webinar, they were asked to give some indication maybe where they were in terms of marketing meat, maybe just beginning, or maybe been marketing meat products or live animals for some time. And it looked as though there was about half of the folks registered that are considering selling live animals and considering meat marketing. So I think it's maybe important that we start with a little bit of background on selling live animals. Many folks oftentimes begin their meat marketing enterprises by selling live animals to local customers who will have them custom harvested for their own family's use, and then they move into retail meat sales or maybe even non-retail meat sales in the future. So we're going to start with that topic and discuss some things that will help minimize business risk when selling live animals for local harvest. We're going to focus quite a bit of our minutes that we have here on this topic on encouraging clear communication and clear documentation between the seller of the animal and the purchaser of the animal, and then also going to spend quite a bit of time focusing on successful relationships with custom harvest facilities. So with that, I want to spend just a moment emphasizing that one of the key factors to selling live animals to local customers hinges on that relationship with a local custom harvest facility. And many times those facilities are called custom-exempt livestock processing facilities. There's about 62 of those across the state of Tennessee, and it's very important for you as livestock producers selling live animals, as well as your customers, to realize that those custom-exempt harvest facilities exist to provide the service of harvesting and processing for the owner of the animal. So it's very important to make sure that if you're selling a live animal to someone and they are going to have it harvested and processed by a custom-exempt facility, that they the person who buys the animal from you are the legal owner of that animal. So you would no longer be the owner. Who you sell the animal to would own the animal, and they would have a relationship with the custom processor to have the animal harvested and processed. Next slide, please. So it's also important to realize that with that definition of a custom harvest facility providing the service of harvest and processing for the owner of the animal, meat from a custom exempt processing plant is packaged and labeled not for sale. So meat that comes from a custom harvest facility can never legally be sold. It is intended to be packaged not for sale. It's intended to be packaged for the owner of the animal to be consumed by the owner and their non-paying family, guests, and their employees. So that's really important and critical to a successful live animal sale. From here on, we're going to focus on issues that are going to help emphasize clear communication between you, the seller of the animal, and your buyers, including your advertisements and all communications, including a bill of sale. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how to develop a real clear document to verify the sale of a live animal, primarily the use of a bill of sale. That bill of sale will help prevent any confusion and will help document that you're selling a live animal. It will help document that your buyer is buying a live animal, and it will minimize your risk as a livestock producer from the appearance of selling meat. At this point, I like to give an example. If a livestock producer were on the farm one evening and a truck pulling a trailer pulls into the farm, and the driver gets out and asks if you have any animals that are finished and ready to be harvested, and would you sell them? You might say, well, yes, I just happen to have two that are ready to go to harvest, and you show the two animals to the person that pulled in the drive with pulling the trailer, and they look them over and they ask how much they are. They pick one out. They write you a check for it. You all load it in their trailer. They leave your farm and they go to a custom processor. In that example, it's real clear that your buyer knew what they were buying. They were buying a live animal. They saw the animal. They considered two animals, but they decided on one. They negotiated a price with you. They paid you for that animal, and they took possession of the animal and took it to a processing facility. In that scenario, it's real clear that they knew what they were buying, and they paid you for it. Keep in mind, every scenario where you might sell a live animal may not look just like that scenario. So we want to improve your chances of being successful in the business of selling live animals, even if your buyer does not come on the farm with a trailer and see the animal and take possession. One of the first things you can do to really improve that relationship and that communication with those buyers, next slide, please, is to make sure that you use live animal terms. It oftentimes confuses buyers and confuses folks when you use carcass terms and you're selling them a live animal. So we encourage sellers to always use live animal terms and avoid using some of those traditional carcass terms like wholes and halves and sides and quarters, and not even using carcass weight. But you're selling a live animal to someone, use live animal terms. The second thing that you can do to really improve this relationship and the successful transaction is to base the sales price on a live animal weight or per head basis. A lot of times folks want to sell it based on carcass weight. That can be difficult and can be complicated and can be confusing to your buyer. So it works best if you can sell it based on a live animal or a live weight price or per head basis, excuse me. And then also make sure that ownership of the animal transfers before harvest. The third thing you can do to really have a great relationship and successful business is to provide and retain a bill of sale. This is an important piece of documentation, and it really helps your buyer understand what they're buying, and it documents that sale. It clarifies the transaction. You want to make sure you include the name of the buyer and the seller. You want to describe the animal in great detail so that it's really clear which animal your buyer is purchasing. Include important information such as the date of the transaction, the sales price, and the payment type, and delivery details. It's always best if you sign it as the seller and get the buyer to sign it as well. Fourth piece of advice is to be sure and document the transfer of funds. If someone pays you in cash, make sure you note that they paid in cash on the bill of sale. If they pay you with a check, make sure you note that on the bill of sale, and then make sure you note on the check what they purchased. You may want to reference the invoice number, describe the animal in some way, get as much information on that check as you can. The fifth piece of information to help improve to minimize your risk and improve a sales transaction of live animals is to make sure there's a clear transaction between the buyer and the processing facility. Once again, go back to that example where someone came onto your farm with a trailer and they took possession of the animal. If they delivered that animal to a processor, they are going to have the only communication with that processor. If you sell a live animal to someone over the phone and you agree to deliver the animal to the processor for them, you may be acting on that buyer's behalf in that communication with the processor, but the processor needs to know that you don't own that animal. You're just delivering it to the processor for the owner of that animal, and you may be communicating with the processor in terms of how the buyer wants the animal cut and how much fat they want in the ground beef and how many pounds they want in patties that they may make for the buyer. So just make sure there's a clear transaction between the buyer and good communication between the buyer and the processing facility. Six is transportation. That's an important part of the transaction. You as the animal seller may provide transportation of the live animal to the processor. You may even provide transportation of the meat from the facility to the owner of the animal. A lot of times people have a question about whether the livestock producer can legally transport the meat. And the regulators that we've talked to over the years have basically said that the owner of the animal owns the meat, and they can have that meat product transported by whom, however they want to. That you may not be totally without some risk in that situation. If you deliver meat and someone were to eat it and get sick, and they claim that you're responsible for them getting sick, you may have some liability there. But from a legal standpoint, the owner of the animal owns the meat of the animal, and they may ask you to transport that meat to them, and there's no regulation that prevents that. A lot of times folks ask the question about selling one animal to more than one buyer in shares. In the state of Tennessee, that is legal. You can sell one animal to more than one owner in shares. Normally, half of a live animal or quarters are the most common. Those are units that processors tend to work with. You get any smaller than that, smaller units than halves or quarters, and many of the processors don't like dividing the meat that much. Just make sure your advertisements are clear and that you're selling shares of live animals and not selling shares of meat. Make sure that your bill of sale is very clear and it indicates how many buyers there were and what portion of the animal that they own. There's a good example that I like to give here. If you're selling one animal in quarters and you need 4 buyers, if you only have 3 buyers and you try really hard to get a 4th buyer for that 4th interest, but you're not able to, when you get to the processing facility to deliver that animal, you've only sold 3 of the quarter interest. You are in effect still the owner of that 4th interest. So that animal still has 4 owners. You're the owner of the 4th interest. And when you go to pick the meat up for those 3 buyers, you will actually be the owner of the 4th interest in the meat. Inevitably, you might get a phone call on the evening after you've picked up that quarter interest, and somebody might be asking if you have a quarter interest in a live animal. We encourage folks to say no, because at that point, if you say yes and you provide them the meat from that 4th interest, you'd be selling meat that came from a custom processor. And I think the second slide we had up there indicated that meat from a custom processing plant can never legally be sold. So just something to keep in mind if you're going to be selling shares of a live animal, but you may in effect be that last owner of the last interest in the animal. Finally, we have one question we get a lot, and that is whether or not a farmer can legally harvest an animal for a buyer. You and your family may have harvested animals for years for your own family's consumption, and you may sell a live animal to a customer, and they may know that you've slaughtered animals for your own consumption for years, and they may ask you if you would provide that service for them. In the state of Tennessee, you're not allowed to do that unless you do have a permit as a custom-exempt processing facility. So in essence, the answer is no, you're not able to provide that service for them unless you are permitted and have a facility for a custom-exempt facility. So the summary of this, basically, to keep in mind, custom-exempt processing can only be done for the owner of the animal. Meat from a custom-exempt plant can never legally be sold, and it's very important for you as livestock producers to make sure you have clear communication and clear documentation of the live animal sale. hopefully that information will be helpful to those that are considering selling live animals, and then your business may grow and you may end up pursuing actual retail meat sales at some point.
Thanks, Rob. And Rob also has a screenshot of the cover of a publication that we have on the topic, and we'll send the link out to that because it has the information that Rob has talked to us about and perhaps a few more details for us. Now, if you're interested in selling meat to individual household consumers, so this might be where you would go and sell meat at the farmer's market or have people come to the farm to purchase meat to take home and use for their families at a roadside stand or personal delivery. Anyway, you're selling that meat to the end consumer. Then that process is regulated by the Tennessee Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Agriculture. To sell meat to retail consumers in Tennessee, that requires a retail meat permit, which is a $50 annual fee. And the Tennessee Department of Agriculture inspectors will take a look at the product label. It'll take a look at your facilities for how you're going to store the meat and transport that meat from the USDA inspected processing facility where that must be processed and packaged to your farm and to where you'll be selling it. You will get that permit and post the permit wherever that meat is sold, whether you take a copy of that permit to the farmer's market with you, for example. And you also will be following some weights and measures regulation. From the USDA side, they regulate the processing facilities and the proper packaging and labeling of the product that will be made available for retail sale. They also regulate special label claims. For example, if you wanted to put a term such as grass-fed or grain-fed or Angus beef or some special term on your label. And they also regulate nutritional labeling for meat products. So the first major hurdle for selling retail meat in Tennessee is that meat must be properly packaged and labeled under USDA inspection. And for this, we're talking about cattle, sheep, hogs, and goat. So as far as we know, as of September 2019, there were 15 USDA inspected plants in Tennessee that were processing for farmers, and this list changes drastically. We know that this isn't many plants, and we know that folks are traveling a long way in some cases to those plants. And we know particularly now in this time that there is a challenge in getting appointments in those plants. That has been a challenge in the past to some degree, but certainly right now that is a big challenge. For retail meat sales, you also must have the product properly labeled, and the label is required to have 8 components, including the product name, a handling statement, the name and address of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor, the USDA mark of inspection and establishment number, the net weight, safe handling instructions, ingredients in order of predominance by weight. If there's more than one ingredient, for example, if you had a sausage or a jerky, nutritional information either on the package or at the point of purchase through a poster that you can download from USDA's website. Additional labor requirements from the state include some weights and measures regulations. So some products are required to have the price per pound and the total price on the package at the point of sale. Our frozen products are only required to have the price per pound, or I'm sorry, the net weight, the price per pound, and the total price. The price per pound can be displayed at the point of sale, and the total price can be calculated at the point of sale. Meat sales must be conducted by net weight. So I can't sell a 4-pound roast for $20. I can sell a 4-pound roast at $5 a pound for $20. So we have to be able to communicate with customers about the net weight, the price per pound, and then the total price of the product when we're talking about meat. Optional label requirements that can be helpful. It may be helpful to have a code date or a lot number on meat. So for example, of the indicating the livestock or the date that that animal was processed, in case that there were a problem either at the processing facility or with a particular animal, that if a recall were needed, that you could only call back the product that was affected. If you can't identify the product that was affected, then you have to recall all of your products. So having some way to kind of indicate what product is what can be helpful. Some producers are interested in making special statements and claims on their label, animal raising claims or geographic claims, and those things require USDA approval. Some statements are claimed or claims are relatively easy to get passed. Those are geographic claims. If you wanted to put the Pick Tennessee Products logo, for example, on your label, or Tennessee beef, if that beef was raised and processed in Tennessee. The terms aged or dry aged, if they're used in accordance with the FSIS definition. So these are things that USDA Food Safety Inspection Service has said, okay, we can do this without further verification. And so those can go on the label. Other claims you have to submit through Washington, D.C. for approval to use. So those might be animal raising claims, grass-fed, no added hormones, no antibiotics administered, for example, natural claims, or nutrition claims. So for those, you've got to submit USDA FSIS Form 7234-1 or use their online label submission and approval system. You have to include a drawing or printer's proof of the label, and then some supporting documentation about what claim you're making, how you're defining that claim, or how you're meeting the approved definition of that claim. Sometimes you would have to include tags from feed or other things, depending upon what you're asking to put on the label, and sign an affidavit that that's how you will do things. You have to do this even if you're using a claim as part of your farm name. So if you were saying Smith's grass-fed beef and thinking, well, I can get away with using that on the label because that's the name of my farm. No, you still have to go through the approval process in order to be able to use that term anywhere on the label. To get a retail meat sales permit, the Tennessee Department of Agriculture inspector will take a look at how you're storing the meat. The freezers or refrigerated units must be dedicated to meat for sale, so you can't have your meat for your family's consumption in the same freezer that you're storing meat for sale in. Those units need to be cleanable and in good repair in a secure location, which is good for you as well. We have had some producers had some meat stolen, and that's never a good day. Away from potential sources of contamination, so you don't want your motor oil or fertilizer or pesticides stored on the shelf above the freezers in your garage, for example. And you have to make those storage units accessible for inspection. Those storage practices must prevent cross-contamination. So if you're selling beef and poultry, you can't put those in the same upright or chest freezer, but if you have a walk-in freezer, you can put those on different ends or different walls. Thermometers are required in those units to verify temperature, and you'll want to keep a log of those temperatures. Refrigerated products must be at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Frozen products must be hard frozen with no freezing of product. So make sure if you're using coolers to transport, that's probably not a great idea to do at the farmer's market where you're opening freezers up and all that cold air is escaping, because any of that product that thaws out can be your dinner, but you can't refreeze it and sell it. Your hands and outer clothing must be clean when handling that meat. So there's a variety of ways that producers are transporting and storing meat. You know, coolers can work well in transporting the meat if you don't have a long way to go between the processor and where you're going to store it. If you're going to put that hard frozen meat in and close it up, you don't want to use just regular ice, because you don't want that ice to melt and get the meat or packaging in water. If you need some cooling, the gel packs or dry out ice works. Other folks will roll a chest freezer into the back of the truck on a trailer and use an inverter to run those in your transport as well. Regular chest freezers or regular stand-up freezers will suffice for storage as long as you're keeping those clean and at temperatures. Other folks progress to the point where they need more storage and work in a walk-in cooler. Some of these products, and we have, I was remiss in not mentioning that we have some partners from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture on the call, but freezers and perhaps some other supplies related to marketing of value-added meat products are typically eligible expenses for the Tennessee Agricultural Enhancement Program cost share for producer diversification in many cases. So if we're looking for that is also a resource. So the retail meat sales permit only allows the sale of meat to household consumers or consumers who are going to take it home and use it. If you're going to be selling meat to non-retail or wholesale consumers, then that is another level of regulation. So if you're planning to sell meat to grocery stores, other retailers, restaurants, hotels, or institutions, then you must register as a wholesaler with USDA. To do that, we would have you contact USDA FSIS representative in Tennessee to have an on-site consultation. And there are now 2 of these folks. Mickey Mancini is in the Hamilton County area, and David Ford is in Shelby County. I guess they meet in the middle. These folks are new to this role in the state, but they would come out and do similar things to what the Tennessee Department of Agriculture inspector would do, just to make sure that your storage facilities were up to par and keeping the meat safe and keeping the meat wholesome until it can get to the consumer. If that inspector deems that you are in compliance, then they will provide you with a USDA FSIS form during that visit, when you can complete that form and submit it. The form is called the Registration of Meat and Poultry Handlers, and it is relatively simple for a USDA form. You add your contact information in and check the meat or meat products category and check that you're a wholesaler and sign it and submit it. And at that point, then you are able to market meat to those non-retail consumers, restaurants, grocery stores, and that sort. There is no fee for this registration, and we have a publication that has a few more details on the inspection process, and that publication is the basic regulatory considerations for retail and non-retail meat sales in Tennessee. A few other publications that may be helpful: Meat Product Labeling Guidance for Direct Farm Marketers talks more about that special label claims process and which claims you would need to get that complete sketch approval for, and which ones that you can go for that generic approval without further verification. There's a good publication called Improving Communications with Your Beef Processor that actually applies to more processors than just beef. Would also apply to others, but one of the biggest challenges that we found with producers is in working with and communicating with their meat processor. Some have worked with several processors over time to try to get the right one that fits with their needs, and we also have a listing of the USDA livestock slaughter facilities in Tennessee, and we will email you links to all of these in the next day or two. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Hal Pepper, who's going to talk a little bit about sales tax regulations and how that applies to meat sales.
Thank you, Megan. Good evening. Yes, we'll jump right in and talk about sales tax on the sales of raised farm products and potential sales tax on sales of farm products that you might purchase and resell. And we'll talk a little bit about sales tax on value-added products and how you might go about registering with the Tennessee Department of Revenue. Next slide, please. So one misconception about sales tax: farmers may think that, okay, I know that there is a general exemption from sales tax on many farm products that I sell. So since that's the case, I don't have to worry about charging sales tax ever. Well, that is a misconception. Even though you might be selling a product on your farm, if it's subject to sales tax, then we do have to worry about it. And even if we don't charge sales tax on such a transaction, if it is subject to sales tax, we're liable for it even if we didn't charge the customer. So we're going to talk about these types of products that you might sell and whether they are subject to sales tax. Next slide, please. So sales tax is actually a privilege tax. It's a tax that permits you to engage in the business of selling tangible personal property at retail. And when we say tangible personal property, we're talking about when you're selling something that you can weigh, that you can measure, that you can touch, in general. And we're specifically talking about sales that are retail sales. So we've been talking about, a retail sale is a sale to a consumer who is going to actually use or consume that product. If you have a sale to someone who is going to resell your product, that's a wholesale sale. So if you sell to a grocery store or to someone else who's going to resell it, that's a wholesale sale. And sales tax does not apply to wholesale sales. And sales tax also applies in some cases to certain services that are at retail. Leasing personal property is an example of a service that would be subject to sales tax. And also if you charge admission to events, those are subject to sales tax. But we're primarily talking tonight about sales of tangible personal property at retail. All right. So we mentioned that there are some exemptions for farmers from sales tax. And The exemptions apply to sales of farm products by the farmer who raised them, and it applies to certain sales of farm products that were purchased from the farmer that raised them, and now the farmer who purchased them is now reselling them. There's also a sales tax exemption on certain value-added products, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the sales of farm products by the farmer who raised them. So if we have a farm product that the farmer raised and now the farmer is selling those products, then those farm products are exempt from sales tax. Even retail sales, they are exempt. So when we mention farm products, we're talking about livestock, we're talking about nursery stock, fruits and vegetables, poultry. All of those are farm products that may be sold by the farmer that raised them to a retail customer. Next slide, please. So the farmer that raises that product and is eligible for that sales tax exemption might be an individual. In most cases, that's probably what we're dealing with in our discussion tonight. But it might also be a partnership. You could have a partnership that is a farmer. You could have a corporation or an LLC that is a farmer. And it can even be a university. If the university owns cattle, the university might even and has in some occasions actually had the animals slaughtered and processed and then sold the meat from those animals. So in that case, the university was the farmer that raised that product, and any of these business entities, sole proprietorship or these others, is eligible for this exemption. It's for the farmer that raised the product. One thing to note is that to be eligible for this exemption, the same business entity or the same business individual must both raise and sell the farm product if the sale is to be considered a raised farm product exempt from sales tax. And I mention that because sometimes you'll have an individual or a group of individuals that might raise a product as a partnership or as an individual, and then they might form an LLC for the marketing entity. Well, in that case, you've got two different entities. One entity raised it, a different entity sold it. And so when that farm product is sold, then it would not be eligible for this exemption because it didn't raise the farm product. Okay, next slide. Sales of farm products by the farmer that raised them, it doesn't matter who they're sold to or where they're sold, and you don't have to have any special registration as a farmer. If you, the farmer, raise farm products and you sell them, then you're eligible for this exemption from sales tax wherever the sale is made and to whomever you sell it to. Okay? So in the first example we're going to look at, we've got Farmer Smith decides to finish 6 calves, and he sells those live finished animals to individuals for custom-exempt processing, and he sells them for $8,000. So we're in this case, we're talking about selling live animals. He's taking them to a custom-exempt processor, and he's selling those. So the question I have is, does Farmer Smith owe sales tax on the sale of those calves to those customers? So we think about that for a moment. How does this fit with what we said? We've got a farmer selling the animals that he raised. And so in this case, it is indeed, there's no sales tax owed on this sale. I think if you want to go forward once on that, we can see the answer to that, Megan. There you go. The sales are exempt from sales tax because Farmer Smith raised the calves. So now let's go to this next exemption that we talked about. We said that in some cases, we might buy, I the farmer, might buy farm products and turn around and resell them. And sometimes those sales are exempt from sales tax too. There's two conditions that have to be met. Number one, we have to purchase the products, the farm products, from the farmer that raised them. Can't buy them from a middleman, from a broker, from a dealer. Got to be purchased directly from the farmer who raised them. That's the first condition that has to be met. And now there's one more condition that has to be met. There's a 50% test. So the dollar amount of farm products raised has to be at least 50% of the total sales of farm products. So when I add the dollars from the sales of my raised products to the dollar amount of sales of products that I purchased from another farmer, I add those two amounts together, and then I divide it, or I take that number, and it's the number I divide the dollar amount of my raised product sales. And it has to be at least 50% raised. So let's look at an example that might make it a little easier to understand. So in this example, we have raised those 6 calves. We sold those to customers who are going to consume them. So it's a retail sale. We sold those for $8,000. And now, hey, demand is so high for these live animals for custom processing, we decide to work with a neighbor, and he finishes some calves also, and he sells them to us for $12,000. Or rather, I sell them. I turn around and sell them for $12,000. So in this case, I've got my 6 head that I raised, and I've got 9 head that I didn't raise. And so the total sales are $20,000. $8,000 from the ones I raised, $12,000 from the ones I didn't raise. So I have $20,000 of sales. To meet the 50% test, I would have to have at least $10,000 of raised animals. But in this case, I only have $8,000. So do I owe any sales tax on the sale of any of the calves? Well, I do owe some sales tax. I owe sales tax on those animals I didn't raise because we didn't meet the 50% test. We bought them from the farmer that raised them, but we didn't also meet the 50% test. So we owe sales tax on those $12,000 of sold animals that we purchased from another farmer. We don't owe sales tax on our raised animals. We never owe sales tax on if the entity selling is the same entity that raised them, those sales are always exempt. So I don't have to pay sales tax on the $8,000 of raised animals. But in this case, I would owe sales tax on the $12,000 of sales. Now, we might ask the question, well, you know, is there any way that we might get around this? Or is there any way that we might be able to take possession of those animals and hold them for a time and raise them and then count them as raised animals? Well, the answer is yes. The Department of Revenue has not said how long you've got to own the animals for them to be considered raised. So, you know, that could be an item that there could be some discussion over, but for the time being, we don't have any clear, specific time that you have to hold those animals and raise them. Now, obviously, if your neighbor raises them and you go pick them up at his farm and take them directly to the processor, you didn't raise them. But, you know, if you had taken possession, if you had fed them and watered them, you know, kept them alive, kept them healthy, and taken possession, then in that case, they might be considered your raised animals. Like they would be. They'd be your raised animals. So some discussion there, but with this example, we're saying that you didn't do that, that instead you just went and picked them up at your neighbor's farm and took them directly to the processing facility. In that case, they're not considered your raised animals, and they would be subject to sales tax. Okay, next slide. So one other exemption that we have is on the sales of certain value-added products. So when you add value to a product that you raised and you do some processing or packaging, then those sales of value-added products are also exempt from sales tax as long as the only non-raised ingredients are salt, water, sugar, pectin, or preservatives. So if we have our raised animals, we take them and get them processed. We get a retail meat permit, and we decide to sell meat, and we're doing it legally. You know, if we're selling steaks, we're selling ground beef, we're selling roasts. In those cases, we don't have anything that we've added to that product. So those sales would be exempt from sales tax. We'll take the next slide there, please. Okay, so here's an example. After you get your retail meat permit, the farmer takes his raised calves to a USDA inspected processor, and then he gets meat. He gets steaks and roasts and ground beef, and he sells those for $12,000. No ingredients were added during processing. That's important to note, because if we add any ingredients other than salt, water, sugar, pectin, or preservatives, now it's not treated as eligible for this exemption as a farm-raised product. But in this case, we didn't add any ingredients during processing. So are those sales subject to sales tax? And the answer is they're not, because he raised the animals and nothing was added to that. Now, let's say we did a sausage and we added a spice. Okay, if we didn't raise that spice, then all of a sudden now the sale of that sausage is subject to sales tax because we added something other than salt, water, sugar, pectin, and preservatives. Okay, next slide. So if there is a sales tax liability, you should check with the Tennessee Department of Revenue and complete an application for registration. There's the link for that registration form. You complete that and submit it online. And then next slide, please. So what rate do you charge? Well, on most items that we would buy in a store, the usual tax rate for most items is 7% for the state rate. And then we add the local tax rate that varies anywhere from 1% to 2.75%. So the maximum combined state and local tax rate for most items is 9.75%. For meat, it gets a lower rate. Unprocessed, unprepared foods and meats or other items like that, consumables, they get a lower state rate. It's 4%, and then you add that local rate of 1 to 2.75%. So it could be up to 6.75% would be the rate that you would charge on that. This is the publication that we have written on sales tax in Tennessee on the purchase and sale of farm products. So that's a resource that you might consult if you have questions about sales tax. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Hal. We will certainly provide our email addresses in the email follow-up email that we send to you, but we hope that you will reach out to us as you continue to consider or expand or work on your value-added meat business, and we will certainly try to stay in contact and help you with any questions you have along the way. Now we will take some questions. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat box, and Rob and Hal and I will do our best to answer, and our colleagues from TDA are here as well if they would like to jump in at any time. You all are welcome to do that as well. I have a couple of questions that were submitted to me via email, and I will start with those. So Rob or Hal, feel free to jump in here and answer these questions. So the first question we had is, to sell to the public, must meat be processed in a USDA inspected facility? And yes, I believe we answered that one, that yes, to be sold, that meat must be processed in a USDA inspected facility under USDA inspection, because some of those facilities also do custom exempt processing, so the inspector has to be there. What do you recommend a first-time beginner do to get started? So Robert, what do you recommend? How should somebody get started in this business?
Well, Megan, I'll take a stab. As I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon for livestock producers to begin by selling live animals to local consumers. There's certainly at this current time, well, not just this current time, but this season, if you will, a lot of interest from consumers in buying local, knowing their farmer, knowing where their food came from. So a lot of times folks, livestock producers, like to start by selling live animals. The regulatory oversight is not as great for selling live animals, and it's a good way to establish relationships with customers and build a customer base, and then kind of grow into the retail meat sales. It's not uncommon that folks begin by selling live animals, and pretty soon they'll find customers who are not interested in purchasing the entire or having all of the meat from a single animal. So they will run into customers who are interested in smaller quantities of meat, and maybe build their business from there. In terms of finding customers, we continue to hear from livestock producers that local farmers markets are a really good way to establish a customer base, whether you're selling live animals or shares of live animals or individual meat cuts. You may not always sell at a farmer's market, but we do hear from a number of folks who find that finding customers at a farmer's market is a good way to start. Those businesses models may change to where they're selling more direct from the farm and less from a farmer's market booth in time, but many of them do start by making contact with customers at farmers markets.
And also on the marketing end, the Tennessee Department of Agriculture has the Pick Tennessee Products marketing program. So that is a wonderful place to get your farm listed and list the products that you have available. And Wendy Sneed is here from the Department of Agriculture. We will include her contact information if she's okay with that. I imagine she will be in the email, and she can help you get set up on the Pick Tennessee Products program website, and then we ask you to keep those listings updated as time goes on. The next question here is, which would be best, starting from a cow-calf operation versus a backgrounding operation? Do we have some resources in Extension who may be able to help us decide what would be the best option?
Megan, since it's silent, I'll jump in. I guess my approach to answering that would be that either one could work. You're basically looking at feeding, handling animals for harvest in a different way than you would a cow-calf operation. It would be a bit of an extension from backgrounding. If someone's already backgrounding cattle and preparing them or providing them with a good background for the next phase of finishing, then they might have a little bit of an edge possibly over a cow-calf operation, but not necessarily so. Either one would work. It's just going to be developing a tad bit of a different system. You're looking at developing some type of a finishing system for those animals. You could go from a cow-calf operation to a finishing operation with an intermediate stage in there, or you go from a backgrounding stage. Either one would work. It's just going to be establishing a tad bit different system for finishing those animals.
I would suggest that you could work with your local extension agent and perhaps your area farm management specialist to assess your farm resources to see, what kind of land and facilities that you have available that might work better for one of those systems, and also with the area farm management specialist that could help with some enterprise budgeting to see, how the bottom line might look as far as what your expenses and possible income could be for those different systems. So those folks can be helpful as well. We had some questions about what do you recommend to feed for growth, and how do you recommend, what do you recommend to feed for finish? Some of that's going to depend on who your customers are and what type of product that they're looking for. So who are you marketing to, and are they looking for a grain finished product or a grass finished product? And that's going to depend on what you feed them, but also on the genetics and the type of cattle that you are raising for them. So you'll need to look at your market for that. And then you'll need some production folks. And we are ag economists, and we may know a little bit. We have some ag background, but we would rely on our ag agents in the counties and the animal sciences specialists that they can connect you with to talk more about what and how much and when and to feed and all of those things. So connect with your county agents to visit about that. Okay, we have some great questions in the chat box here, and we recognized earlier that the processing is a big bottleneck right now. With the farmers have gotten more demand from consumers for meat and are wanting more processing dates, and their processing capacity is limited. So the great questions we have here are related to what can we do to process and sell direct to the consumer? Is custom exempt processing attainable to an average farmer? Is there somebody who would like to address, is custom exempt status attainable?
Hey, Megan.
Yes.
This is Wendy. So a couple of us could probably touch on this one, but if you do have interest in custom exempt inspection, feel free to contact me. I know Megan's gonna put my information in some of the emails that she sends out. But so I'm working with probably 30 prospects across the state right now, from Memphis all the way to Tri-City, on all scales. So we have people that are looking at, there's multiple options. So there's custom exempt status. So you could process the animals and meat on your farm. Of course, like Robin mentioned, that meat could not go into retail or into commerce. Another option that we have some producers looking at right now, which is a good option, is they are still allowing or working with their processors to harvest the animals, but then they're bringing those hives back on farm and further processing there. And depending on who you're selling to, there are options to be inspected by TDA or USDA. So we do have some producers that are working that direction on farm. And then we're also working with several people on looking at USDA inspection. So there's multiple options. There's a lot of things to consider when you're looking at your building and how that might come to fruition, along with, wastewater, offal disposal. There's just a lot of moving parts. So if anybody has interest, please just let me know. Myself, I know, Hal and I are working on some projects. Rob and Megan have talked with many people, but there's a lot of resources out there to help if that's an idea that you have.
Thank you, Wendy. We will definitely include your contact information in the publication about retail and non-retail meat sales. There is a section on becoming a retail food store, which is kind of like becoming a butcher shop and a grocery store. And I will include some additional information about that as well. For that, you would be permitted through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture as a retail food store, like a grocery store would be. And then you are allowed to sell to retail consumers, and a percentage of your sales can be made to wholesale consumers. And there's some federal regulations about how many sales can be made. And so I can include that information in the email as well.
Megan, this is Mike Brown. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Okay.
clear, Mike.
Yeah. Let me just kind of expand on what Wendy said just a little bit. The actual facility certainly can be done on a farm, and it's basically we require the same things that we would require for any other food manufacturing facility, meaning that you have appropriate sanitation, SOPs in place. Standard operating procedures in place. You have approved water sources. Wendy mentioned that. I know a lot of farmers are in a position to probably want to use spring water or well water, and that's certainly fine. But that makes another level of regulatory that you have to get that inspected regularly, as opposed to just a municipal water source, and that would all need to run through. And I believe Wendy mentioned this as well, the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, to determine that you have an appropriate place to dispose of the carcass and the liquid waste. So just make sure and put my information on there, and I can be a resource as well.
Great. And Mike, here's a follow-up question that you may be able to expand on as well. So is that retail meat store permit different than the farm-based retail meat permit? Yes, it is, Kimberly, but Mike can probably tell you more about that. You want to expand on that?
Well, it differs in that typically a retail meat store is selling other things that you have bought, that you're acting as a reseller for. I think that's the main difference probably between those two.
Well, in this case, the retail meat store would be the further processing. So if you have a farm-based retail meat permit, you're getting that meat packaged, labeled, frozen, ready to be sold to the consumer in cuts. In a retail meat store, you could be getting a half or a quarter of your animal from a USDA inspected processor in big hunks, and you take that back and you are further processing, cutting into cuts, grinding meat, making sausages, packaging, labeling at that store and selling. So that's the difference.
Yes, that's correct. I misunderstood. Yeah, the retail meat permit would be just a traditional butcher shop, as opposed to the on farm. So you're exactly right.
Let's see. How much time should one expect between filling out a retail meat permit application, being inspected, and actually receiving your permit?
Okay, I can answer that one as well. Typically, it's about 1 month from the time we receive your paperwork. It typically takes a week or so to get through our compliance department. The inspectors who will come out to your farm normally operate on a 2-week planning schedule. So depending on what their schedule is, normally, and I emphasize that word, normally it's about a 1 month period. But by the time we receive a complete, approved, and everything is to us, and then the moment the inspector approves everything at the farm level, then you're permitted and ready to go. You do not have to wait to receive your official permit in the mail. you'll have a temporary permit that'll be issued by the inspector.
Right. So Tennessee has a processing exemptions for poultry to sell direct to consumer with basic sanitary requirements and labeling. Is Tennessee looking at anything similar for beef? I'll lead by saying I think those processing exemptions, and I think Wendy put those here. Those are federal rules that Tennessee has adopted, and so Tennessee has also adopted the federal rules for meat processing. And Mike or Wendy, you may be able to expand or correct that.
I think that's about it on that one. I know, CPA worked with us a lot in past years on the small farm poultry exemption. But as we mentioned, that is just one allowable area through the federal. And so as far as beef, we're still having to, work under their federal guidelines.
Megan, just to emphasize one thing, there seems to be some confusion that rabbit fall under the same exemption as poultry, and that is not true. Rabbit is somewhat of a difficult issue because it's outside of USDA's normal inspection guidelines. So you can actually go with a voluntary USDA inspected facility or an FDA inspected facility. The category of rabbits seems to be growing, I guess, just as quickly as rabbits do. A lot of people are getting very interested in that. So if there's there's a lot of confusing information out there. So if anybody needs specifics on that, just have them reach out to me.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so here's one where I wish we had a crystal ball for a lot of things lately, but do you think once the pandemic is a lot better, several people will cancel their appointment at the processor? Anyone want to weigh in on that one?
Megan, I just made the comment. I've talked to several producers who have actually double booked. So, they might call one processor close by and make a reservation or appointment, and then they're going to call one or two more, and they're basically seeing where they can get in first. The problem is when they do that, a lot of the times they forget to call and cancel their appointments. So once again, as Rob and Megan have alluded, make sure you do build that great relationship with your meat processor, because when those openings do come up, they're looking for people to fill those slots. And so if you have a good relationship, there's a good chance they might call you to see if you could, slide into one of those open spots. We're not sure that's what's going to happen, but I do know that from a couple of the producers and processors I've spoken to, I think we're going to have some double and triple bookings around the state.
Right. Yeah, it certainly wouldn't hurt to make some phone calls and get on a waiting list if you can and make those connections. We've had several questions about, will this be recorded? Yes, we are recording it. We will send you all the link hopefully tomorrow, and it will be posted on our website, and we'll post it on our Facebook page as well. And we'll also provide the slide handouts and several other links. And my list of information to send you is growing as we talked through these questions. So you'll have a lot of resources if you so desire or have trouble sleeping and need something to put you to sleep. There's somebody, I am looking back through the chat box asking about, is there a price guide? We have a publication about pricing your products for marketing direct to the consumer. And there are also some other resources about, retail beef cutout prices, just kind of across the board in the nation. And there's also some local food prices sources available. Another way that I use the Pick Tennessee Products page is to go through and maybe look at some other local producers and see what they're charging for products. So pricing is part science and part art. The place you need to start is at your costs, and know that you're able to cover your costs with the prices that you're charging, and hopefully meet the goals that you have for your operation for the return on your investment in time. and also need to consider what your consumers are willing to pay and what they're able to pay, and also what the competition is charging as well. So there's lots of different factors to consider in pricing, and I'll try to include some pricing resources for you all in that email.
Megan, let me just emphasize the marketing side of that. I talk to people all the time who will go into their local grocery store and compare meat prices to what they're doing. And I strongly encourage people not to do that, because it's clearly a different product. And I think a lot of producers would be surprised at the prices that their consumers are willing to pay. And I'm not suggesting gouging at all, but certainly the general consumer in our market today understands that there are different pricing structures involved in this type product than there are with the meat coming into a traditional grocery store. So I just encourage you to be aggressive with that and make sure you're paid for all your efforts.
Another question here, how do you find a good reputable processor? What are some signs to look for in various processors?
Lisa, first, I would probably start with the publication that Megan mentioned on how to build a relationship with a processor and kind of review that. And then I would talk to maybe some other producers in your area or around the state, see who they're using. But I would just set up either a call or maybe a visit with a processor and just kind of see if they could meet the standards that you're looking for and can provide the service that you need.
Definitely a lot of conversation, and if they'll give you some references, or if you know of some other folks that work with them, that is also a good thing to try to check out. Someone would love to hear opinions from anyone on advice to approach already established processing facilities concerning the custom-exempt processing. Would approach them with the scenario of give and take. The slaughter and quarter portion is quick, and the further processing is the time-consuming portion. It seems like a win-win, but I don't know how they will respond to this request. Okay, I think you're talking about if you're going to a USDA-inspected processing facility with an animal, you want them to harvest the animal and break it down into quarters and halves, and then you take those quarters and halves to your on-farm permitted facility through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, if you're selling retail for a retail food store, to break it down and further process. Wendy and I were talking about this earlier. I feel like processors would be open to that discussion, because you're right, that portion is just a portion, and that would get that out of their way, so they could do more. Now they will want compensated for that, and to make sure they're covering their costs, and to make a return on that as well. Wendy, do you have some insight about that too?
I would just say, Kimberly, we can probably I think I'm familiar with who you're using, and we could probably have that conversation with them if you'd want to. I've actually had 2 USDA processors in the state who have called me this week to help work with one of their producers each who have an interest in doing on-farm further processing. So, like Megan said, I think it's one that they're willing to have because they are so backed up that they're still there to be there and offer the service for harvest, but to get that actual cutting out, that's where a lot of the backlogs happen.
Thank you. And thanks to Hal for putting in a link to the, there's a resource that Cornell Extension has that's a livestock meat price calculator that also could be a helpful resource in trying to figure out what prices to charge. Any other questions that you have this evening? I'm trying to look back through. I didn't intentionally skip or miss any. So if I haven't gotten to yours, I will try to look for that. Wendy put her Sales tax. There is a question on sales tax. On the sales tax deal, it sounds like it's better to keep selling individual cuts as a farm and not start a meat sales part of the business. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, on that question, I'm not sure I totally understand it. I mean, there are advantages to either way. I'm not sure that I would let sales tax be the determining factor about whether to sell. I don't know if we're asking about selling live animals versus selling meat, or if we're talking about something else. But you know, if you're selling steaks or roasts or ground beef from the animals that you raised, you do not owe sales tax on that. So I'm not sure I'm following the question. Megan, do you have any insight on that?
I didn't either. If there is some clarification on the question, we'll try again if you want to try to ask it again. I will ask you one, Hal. So how do I know if I need a business license for my meat marketing business?
Ah, good. Okay. So I didn't think we were going to have time to talk about that, so I didn't develop any slides on that. But if you are selling something that you didn't raise, okay, so let's back up. If you're selling only the items that are meat products from your raised animals, you do not need a business license. No need to fool with it if you're only selling raised farm products. But if you sell more than $3,000 of any kind of product that you did not raise, then you would need a business license. And if you sell a value-added product that's made from the animal that you raise, if you're selling meat and it's the steaks and it's the roasts and the ground beef from animals you raise, it's a processed product, it's a value-added product, you still do not need a business license to sell those products. But let's say that you are selling sausages that has a spice in them that you didn't raise, and it's not salt, water, pectin, sugar, or preservatives. So now all of a sudden, that's treated as a product you didn't raise. And if you sell more than $3,000 of those products, those sausages, in a year, then you would need a business license. There's actually two types of business licenses. One is a minimum activity business license. It's for when you have sales between $3,000 and $10,000 of product. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what the fee is. I'm thinking it's like $50 for that minimum activity license. If you have sales over $10,000 of products you didn't raise, then you would need a standard business license. And in either case, the tax is not very much. It's more of just some extra paperwork to deal with. Yeah, you would need a business license if you're selling things you didn't raise. That is, if you and there is no 50% rule with the business license like there is with sales tax. So the business license catches folks a lot more than the sales tax does. It's just something you need to be aware of, and file for that with your county clerk office. So I'm seeing there's a question here about selling retail meat. Okay, so in this case, you have a retail store on a farm. The retail store is buying calves from the farm to sell the meat as individual cuts. Okay, so the question is, did the retail store that is buying and reselling, if that's all they're doing, if they don't own any cattle, they don't raise any themselves, and they're just strictly buying calves from somebody else and selling the meat, then they would need to be concerned about sales tax possibly. But if the farm is raising those animals and it sets up a retail store on its farm, it's able to sell those retail cuts as long as it's got the proper permits. You know, it can sell those without having to worry about sales tax. The issue becomes once they are not raising those animals, and you know, if they don't meet the 50% test, if at least 50% of their sales are not from their raised animals products, then they would need to charge sales tax. I'm not sure on your situation, what you've described, if it meets that test or not.
And sometimes how even a single farm will raise the animals under one business, the farm business, and they might transfer those animals or sell those animals to a separate business structure as a risk management tool for liability purposes or other purposes. And so if that new business enterprise doesn't raise those animals for any time, then that business enterprise, even if owned by the same people, would be liable for sales tax then when they sell those things. So we see that in different situations.
Right. And so in that case, it would be subject to sales tax.
Great. Another great question here: who determines whether a farm has the septic or wastewater capabilities for processing? Is that by the county?
Yeah, Megan, this is Mike Brown again. I can cover this one. The TDA relies heavily on county regulatory authorities. And so, yes, the short answer is yes, it certainly is determined by the county and the state. Typically, TDEC has regional offices, and the county will reach out to the TDEC regional specialist to come in and determine what kind of liquid and solid waste procedures there are, and if it's approved.
So TDEC is the Tennessee Department
Yeah, I'm sorry,
of
Department
Environment
of
and Conservation, right?
That's correct. Forgive me. Yes, that's right.
That's okay. We live by all those acronyms, and it's sometimes hard to remember that others
Right.
don't.
Right.
Wonderful. I believe that we have gotten all of the questions that we have in the chat box. We thank you all for being here and for the great questions that you submitted. Thank you to Rob and Hal and joining me in presenting, and to Wendy Sneed and Mike Brown from the Department of Agriculture for helping to answer these questions. And we are here for you. We want to help in any way possible. So please stay in contact with any of us who you feel would be appropriate for your continued questions as you consider different things for your farms and operations. Thank you for being here tonight, and stay well.